Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Intuition Activation Podcast. I'm your host, Jessica, a spiritual medium and intuitive coach, and I'm so excited that you're here to join me for this intuitive development journey. Guys, I have a very special episode for you today. I have a beautiful guest. His name is Chaim Karpel, and I am having him on because he is one of my clients, actually, in a conversation that we were having a couple of weeks ago, reached out to me and said, she asked me, she said, Jessica, I would really love for you to do an episode on the Jewish perspective on channeling and connecting to spirit guides and what that means, because there's a lot of misconception in a lot of religious circles, both Jewish circles, Christian circles, a lot of different religions, sort of have maybe some misgivings, or maybe they're not so it's a little unclear as to whether it's okay to work with a spiritual medium, to work with a psychic, to work with a medium, to connect with loved ones from the other side, to channel spirit guides. There's kind of like not a lot of writing out there as opposed to whether it's allowed or not allowed, and what does that look like. And so this client of mine who is Jewish as well, she said, I really love working with you. I love having sessions with you. And I know you're Jewish and I'm Jewish, and we really feel that it's really beautiful and okay, but I wanted to share your work with friends, and I've been getting a lot of pushback. They don't think that they should come and see you because they're not sure that they're allowed to. And so that sort of brought me to this place of curiosity, because she wasn't the first one to ask me this. And it's even a question that my husband and I have had, sort of what are the parameters of channeling within the Jewish religion that we actually practice, that my husband and I practice. And we weren't actually really that sure. I know there are some things that are not okay in Judaism, or considered not okay in Judaism. But what other thing I realized is that a lot of the concepts that come through in what I teach here on this podcast, a lot of the concepts that I have learned to be true, through channeling for these beautiful beings of light, through talking to spirit guides, through talking to angels, and connecting to source, or the divine, if you will, are concepts that actually appear in Jewish texts and in Judaism, and in Jewish mysticism, which is also known as Kabbalah. And the more that I looked into it, and the more that I studied it and tried to research it, the more I realized that a lot of the things that I talk about are actually acknowledged in Judaism. And they just have different terminology, different names for the same thing, or just sort of a little bit of a different lens or way of looking at it. And so I wanted to bring Chaim on the podcast because I don't claim to be somebody who knows all of the things about, the Jewish religion, and all of the rules that kind of go on in Judaism. And so I wanted somebody who had a little bit more knowledge than I do. And so Chaim is ordained as a rabbi, although he's not a practicing rabbi, as he'll explain on the podcast. He does have a lot more background knowledge than I do. So I didn't want to sort of explore this topic without the help of somebody else. So some of the things that we talk about is sort of what is the concept of a spirit guide? Does it exist in Judaism? And sort of what does that look like? Is it allowed to connect with spirit guides in the Jewish religion? Is that something that we're even allowed to do? Um, and what does that look like? And what would we even call it? And then we dive into some of the other topics, right? We talk about angels, we talk about reincarnation, we talk about connecting with loved ones on the other side, and all of these things, and how they are sort of explored or considered through a Jewish lens, through a Jewish perspective. Now, guys, even if you are not Jewish, I really highly recommend that you don't just put this down and walk away, and actually have a good listen to this episode, because it is so interesting to understand the concepts that Chaim explains. It's such an interesting and beautiful perspective and outlook on life and on spirituality. So there is a little bit of something for everybody in this episode. And it's not just about can you or can't you within the Jewish religion. It's really sort of about a different view, a different lens of what it means to be a soul here on the planet, having a human experience. And it's so inspiring. I know I walked away from this conversation so inspired, and I can't wait for you to listen to it and hear what Chaim has to say. So without further ado, here is the wonderful, the amazing Chaim Karpel. Well, hello, Chaim, and thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm so excited to have you here. It's really been kind of a long time coming because I've had so many clients ask me to do this topic specifically, and I didn't really feel like I was or had enough knowledge to share in this perspective in this area. And so I'm so happy that you agreed to come on and just share with us what you do know about everything Judaism. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me on. This is my first ever podcast appearance, and I think just for your listenership, they should know like there are certainly people out there who are much more knowledgeable in every area of spirituality and religious practice, much more so than I am. But I think kind of where I lend, a filter to this is really being able to bridge the gap between the the religious mind, the spiritual mind, and kind of the everyday person, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be fair, we had a point of connection. I knew you, and you were a patient of my husband's, and we have done a session together. So I felt, comfortable to reach out to someone when I was brainstorming, like, who could I ask, right, to talk about this topic? You were the only person I thought of. So so thank you anyways. I even if you don't feel like you're an authority, I think that you still have so much to share. And so I'm so excited for you to be here. And I do want to start by just like introducing you to everyone. So I would love if you could start by just sharing with us a little bit about who you are, where you grew up, what your upbringing looked like, and what do you do now?
Sure. So I try to hit like the key bullet points.
Yeah.
Uh, I'll work backwards. So I currently work in Toronto. I've been here for 15 years. Born and raised in the New York, New Jersey area originally. I moved here really after the great financial crisis for job opportunity. My wife has grew up in Toronto, just around the corner from where we currently live. I'm a father. I'm a husband. I have three children, teenage children. So I had my children when I was younger, not so
Mm.
old. And Professionally, I work in investment sales. I work for a commercial real estate firm, and I raise capital for them. But previous, like kind of how I grew up, more in like I grew up in New York, New Jersey. Um, it's kind of I would say my religious background. I hate things categorizing things, but for people to kind of get a perspective as to my lens of life, I guess it would be helpful. So the term that people put on it would be modern Orthodox. I guess that's to me that means that my house was observant, Shabbos, kosher. Those were all learning Torah, going to shul, praying were all priorities and things that were instilled in us and my siblings from a very young age. But coupled with that were we had television in the house and we read secular books and getting a secular education. I went on to university and graduate schools. So I've, getting higher education was a part of that. So it was very much learning how to integrate being an observant Jew with living in the modern world and not, cutting yourself off from those things. Um, yeah, I think that's somewhere built into that story. I lived in Israel for a couple of years. I concurrently became an ordained rabbi and got my MBA. I lived in Houston, Texas, where I worked as a rabbi for a very short while. And the joke I tell people is I went from selling religion to selling investments because the margins are better. But
I love that. That's amazing. Yes, I was hoping you would mention that you are ordained because that gives you a little bit of a leg up here in the authority piece of knowledge as
yeah,
well.
I
Yeah.
mean, the ordination piece, like, well, yes, it's very much a part of my story and where I came from. It almost feels funny to identify, or for when I come across people from Houston or my previous life, so to speak, people, will reference to me as, oh, Rabbi Karpel or Rabbi Chaim. It's like, and it still doesn't feel like they're talking to me. It feels like I'm like, oh, who are they talking to? Yeah, it's kind of a interesting part of my life that, yeah, I don't know.
Well, you know what? Honestly, that's really what we preach in on this podcast a lot is really kind of being attuned to what your soul purpose is and what your true path and purpose is, and being really in tune with what feels aligned for you, and then being open to shifting when if society told you one path didn't feel right, that you actually don't pigeonhole yourself into one thing because everybody else thought it was the right path, but rather listening to what feels good for you and doing the thing that actually feels aligned. So I actually commend you for that because I can imagine that probably a lot of the people in your inner circle were maybe pushing you back towards that path and you kind of chose to dare to do something different. Would you say that's true?
Um, I wouldn't say that the people around me were pushing me back towards that path. I think that the people, firstly, because I've moved, like I don't live near a lot of the people I grew up with.
Mhm.
Um, so a lot of them weren't around when I was having that change in my life. And so they kind of saw, Chaim 1.0 and then was reintroduced to Chaim 2.0 at some point after the fact. But when the whole changes were happening, they weren't around to be like, what are you doing? Why are you thinking this way? Like, just so I think it's an excellent segue, but I think it would probably be worthwhile to just maybe take a little bit of more perspective just about how I grew up religiously, like what my perspective of was religiously and kind of why or how things shifted and changed, and why I took, why I adopted more of, I guess, a spiritual lens on reality or on my reality. So religion, growing up Orthodox, growing up observant, the way it was taught to me and the way I was taught to understand it was very much about following a set of rules. There was, things we can and can't do, and by following that set of rules and you kind of abiding by communal expectations, familial expectations, life was just going to kind of unfold in a very natural, normal way. And you just kind of go through life, you check these boxes and you go forward. So, there were conversations. We obviously hear things about the soul or Mashiach, Messiah. Like there are like spiritual ideas that get dropped in here and there, but for the most part, what I was raised with and what I was understanding was that really we live in this world, and the way we worship God in this world is through, trying to build a connection with Him through fulfillment of mitzvos and through prayer. Like, and that was really, that it was really put into that context. And the better you were at those things, the better Jew you were. The more you learned, the more rigorous you were in whatever categories, the better you were at fulfilling this role. And for me, that worked until it didn't work, and then I was having, I was, to make a long story short, in my late 20s, I had 3 kids, and was kind of struggling in my identity, struggling professionally, and the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results, and kind of, I lost a lot of weight, and then I met a person who, kind of opened my eyes up to more of a spiritual way of thinking, and started, you know, reading Eastern philosophy, started meditating, and then my brain was like, oh, this is what this means in Judaism. This is what this means in Judaism. And I started building all these connections between the terminology that was given for me through a more secular spiritual lens and building that bridge into the Jewish foundations that I had. And then from there, I started learning Jewish spirituality, Kabbalah and Hasidus, and things that would then inform, my Jewish religious perspective through a spiritual lens.
Yeah. And it's so interesting because I mean, I've actually never shared on this podcast what my Jewish upbringing looked like because people kind of didn't even know that I was Jewish until I mentioned it recently through Instagram stories. And some of my clients went, "Oh, you're Jewish too." And so I realized that, that wasn't something that I really put out there as much. And it's so funny because I'm coming from a very different background from you. I was actually raised conservative, which I guess for those of you who don't know what that means, it's sort of like there are, I guess we would call it varying degrees of observance, right? And so if there was sort of like an Orthodox would be maybe the most observant, and then you would kind of work your way down. There's also different varying philosophies on, I guess what that looks like. I went to a Reform Jewish day school, which is a little bit more Zionist and less practicing, right? So my family, they kind of only did the main things, right? They kind of did, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Passover, and we went to shul every other Saturday, but we drove there, right? Like it was, it was kind of like a pick and choose kind of Judaism. And I actually went through my own kind of spiritual awakening at 18 years old. I decided that I went to something called NCSY or Torah High, which is like the reason my mother put me in it was just because you can get a really good grade from an external source and it boosts your GPA in high school. So that's why she put it in. She put me in there, but little did she know that I would actually really enjoy it, and loved it so much that I actually took a year off after high school and went to seminary, went to live in Israel for a year and just study Judaism. And so I would be what you would call maybe a Baal Tshuva. And so I definitely spent a lot of time studying about this religion that I knew I was, but didn't know anything about, and kind of went, this was not taught to me. I didn't know any of this. I thought it was just these couple of things, right? That you go to synagogue on these couple of times a year. I had no idea everything. And even what it meant to keep Shabbat, I had no idea. And so spent a whole year studying that and spent the greater part of my time in university after coming home back to Toronto, trying to be a practicing Orthodox Jew and meeting with a lot of resistance from the people around me. So my family not being so thrilled that I was trying to do that. And then it wasn't until I sort of met my husband in university where he was coming at it from the other side, where he was raised modern Orthodox, went to an all boys religious school, and he was resenting it. He was feeling like it was rules being shoved down his throat. And so he was coming at it from like, I want to come down from this, and me kind of going, I want to grow into this. And we kind of created a middle ground together. And that's sort of where we've been sitting for a while and slowly kind of adding things and kind of experimenting with how we want to do it. And it's definitely changed since we've had children, and realigning and reassessing our values of how much do we really want to make sure that we kind of instill this in our kids. And so it's definitely been growing a little bit more. But, there's definitely been sort of a, how do I reconcile this with my current job, right? What it is that I do in channeling, and having friends from different backgrounds, or even from more religious or Orthodox Jewish backgrounds, kind of going, are you allowed to be doing this? And then I've been having some clients asking me the same thing. Is this allowed in Judaism? And I do know that, Kabbalah which is Jewish mysticism, right? So there are Jewish texts that are not necessarily taught to us, right? At the beginning, there's rules around who's allowed to study it. And when I did come across it and started to learn, I kind of went, a lot of the things that I've been talking about or been experiencing in my channeling journey are sort of outlined somewhat in these Kabbalistic texts, if you will, or books that I've been reading. Kind of go, oh yeah, like this is a concept that kind of is in, it's definitely in, I guess what you would call New Age terminology, and there is a Jewish version of that, right? And so I'm learning that the two actually can come together, and there's actually a lot of overlap there. And so I would love if we could sort of dive into some of that and kind of look at what is the Jewish overlap with some of these truths that I've learned over time through my channeling journey and my spirituality journey to be true. And I love now discovering that what, Judaism had it right the whole time. It was all in there. I just didn't know where to look.
Yeah, for sure. I think to that point, what I found in my journey is that, I can't speak for other religions because have never really done any kind of, scholastic investment into what other religions practice and what they believe. But I could tell you that, what I believe religion is really a starting point for accessing divine,
Yeah.
and it's a point of connection that you're supposed to. A lot of the practices that we have in Judaism, like simple things like when you walk through the door, you kiss a mezuzah. When you eat food, you bless it. They're really mindfulness practices.
Yeah.
Boil them down to, you understand why you're doing them. It's just to bring you into the present moment.
Mhm.
So, the challenge, just to go back, the challenge that I had was that when you were raised with it, and it's just about it seems to be just about checking the boxes. You don't understand why you're doing it. You just think you're doing it because, there's this reward and punishment system. And if you do the right thing or you avoid doing the wrong thing, then you get rewarded. And the opposite is true. And spirituality is stepping into, a lens beyond, the religious framework, beyond just the do's and don'ts, into a perspective that you are inherently worthy. You have a soul that's an aspect of the Creator. Yeah, and then from there you start understanding there's a just there's this Jewish idea of teshuva, to return to, people say it means to repent, but it's this idea that if you acknowledge there's a process that's given, the three-step process, which is not beyond the scope of the conversation. But regardless, tshuva basically means that you wipe yourself clean and you're starting fresh. And your sins, not only are you absolved of your sins, but depending on the type of tshuva you're able to do, those sins actually become merits for you. So we learn that the soul, which is this piece of the Creator, is way beyond just this hierarchy of do's and don'ts, and reward and punishment, which I think, again, from a little bit of studying that I've done, has really been co-opted a lot from Christianity. This idea of you know being born in sin or living as a sinner, like, that's not really, from what I've learned, it's not really a Jewish concept.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. I would love to sort of dive into this Jewish concept because this really is, if the more that I sort of dive into this, whether it's through a Jewish lens or just a spirituality lens, I always really love to talk about sort of the if we want to kind of point it to like the point of it all, right? Like the purpose of being here in the first place, right? And so from my view and sort of the understanding that I kind of have accumulated over time is really that we are this soul, right? This spiritual being having a human experience, right? And as you so beautifully pointed out, right? Like this soul is a piece of God, source, the universe, whatever you want to call it, right? It is this piece of that, a piece of the divine, and that maybe the purpose of all of the things that we're doing here is to come back to that understanding that the more we do these practices, the more we recognize, realize, remember, if you will, that we really are a creation of the divine. Would you say that that's sort of, do you have a different perspective on this?
I would say that that's true. I think that one part of it is that internal recognition that that's who you are, that's what your inherent truth is. But I think the second piece of that is that we were then placed on a physical plane. We were a soul put into a physical body for the very purpose of uplifting the physical. And when when God created Adam and put him in the Garden of Eden, he said, "You're here to rule the earth." You're with basically, the way I interpret it, the way I understand it, is that by being given a soul, we were made co-creators with God, and we were given power to run the earth. Not that we should, you know, destroy it of its resources and hoard resources, but that we should uplift this physicality, our bodies, the physical world. Again, back to the idea of making blessings on food. We're here to uplift the physical and bring it into something spiritual, and that's true with everything in the physical world. Has the capacity to be uplifted into something spiritual through us engaging in it in such a way. So it's both. It's, yes, we are a physical body, we are a soul in a physical body, and part of it is this unlearning or this relearning that, how to separate, from the physical and uplift this and become more spiritual. But at the same time, it's not just us but the world around us, uplifting the physical into spiritual.
I really love that. That's so beautiful. So I would really love to dive into then the little bit more woo woo side of this, which is the spirit guide, the idea of a spirit guide, right? So I kind of come to the idea, and I never say that I have a full complete definition of what a spirit guide is, because I tell people like it's my working definition because it keeps changing. The more that I connect with these beautiful spirits and beings of light, the more I kind of feel like this shifts. And what I've come to learn sort of over time is that in the same way that I sort of view an neshama or a soul as like a piece of source, right? I also see a spirit guide, right? Just as everything within the world is sort of a piece of source or a creation of source, it's a piece of it and a small piece of that. There's sort of also this understanding, at least in my belief, that there's kind of this feeling of it is so beyond our brain to kind of fathom the idea of talking directly to God. And although we're always encouraged to do so and pray directly to God, it can feel hard to not have something to hold on to visualize. And that's where we can kind of, then we can get close to things like idol worship. And I know that that's not really allowed in Judaism, but I always say that when people ask me, like, "What is it when you're talking to a spirit guide?" I say, "I'm talking to God. It's a piece of God. It's the same thing, right? It's just sort of it's coming through, this energy coming through in a way that I feel like I'm talking to something instead of talking to the air." I wanna know, I'm curious on your perspective of this on this.
Okay, so I actually pulled up the 13 principles. Maimonides was a great Jewish writer, philosopher, scholar, and he wrote what are called the 13 principles of faith.
Okay.
So the fifth principle of faith is that the imperative to worship God exclusively and no false god, no foreign false gods. So when it
Mhm,
comes to worship, we have to worship all that is. We have to worship the oneness. That's like primary. But
mhm.
then the sixth of the principles of faith is the belief that God communicates with man through prophecy.
Interesting.
So I
Mm,
would maybe push back to you and ask you, so you're talking directly to God and then you're hearing back through, again, there's different levels of prophecy. There's like what's called nevuah, which is like, and then there's ruach hakodesh.
mhm,
Arguably, nevuah doesn't exist anymore. There's a piece of the Talmud that says that we lost nevuah at some point in history, but let's assume that ruach hakodesh, which is divine spirit, which refined intuition, if you will, still
mhm.
exists. So would you say that when you're channeling, your your prayer and your is speaking to God, and then you're listening back and you hear it through different sources?
Mm, a good way of putting it out. So, I mean, in my actual practice, what it looks like is me calling in spirit guides, loved ones, angels, and then I say, any beautiful being of light who wants to come through, right? Any being of light that wants to come through with, I guess, the encapsulated understanding that all of it is part of source, but I do call them in as separate things, right? And then when I see it, because I am clairvoyant, so I see things come through in my mind, and it looks like, it looks like these they sometimes look like people, sometimes they look like fairy tale like creatures, right? They can look like a whole different things and they morph and change. And the way that they come through really is kind of irrelevant. It's usually that the way they come through is very metaphorical to the messages they're trying to convey. So for example, like I was channeling for a client the other day and it looked like this woman who was like digging through the soil and picking up some it looked like she was trying to pick up crystals or something out of the ground. And she then went on to tell me this whole metaphor about what that actually meant. So, do I think that I was talking directly to this woman? No, I think I was talking to spirit or source who was coming through with a vision to help convey a message, if you will.
Yeah, so I think that's kind of, I think that's the slippery slope that I think people are concerned about when they speak with you. It's like we said earlier before we started recording. It's like there's worship, and
Mhm.
worship needs to be to God alone.
Yeah.
But then there's conversation and intuition and messages and things that we pick up, as our souls become more and more attuned, things that we're able to pick up, which are coming from source. God provides messages through like you said earlier, like everything needs to be viewed as a part of the creator and a piece of the source. And so, you know, are you able to interpret it? Or is one able to interpret it? I believe so. I believe yes. I believe that, that's part of our tradition as well, that there's always been, you know, people who have who are more refined, they have more refined antennas to be able to pick up signals that not everyone is able to pick up.
Yeah. And so then I guess I'm wondering what your view on this is that sort of I kind of love to say that there is sort of like this the way I kind of define a spirit guide is like the piece of source that's directly assigned to you. So in the sense that, if you're kind of let's say you're going through your life and you have sort of an ultimate path and purpose here, right? But you're not living in your authenticity. So then there are sort of things that happen in your life, signs and messages and symbols and scenarios that kind of come your way that will kind of knock you back into alignment if you are not living in your truth. Right. And so I like to say that, for me, the example I give is that I was a teacher, right? And I was hating life, getting sick all the time, anxious all the time, hating life unconditional, like unabashedly just so miserable with life, but also so convicted in my belief that this is what I was supposed to do because what family and friends and everybody around me told me was a, good job to have, right? And so then, circumstances came about that kind of made me wake up and kind of go, oh man, I need to stop doing this, right? And so I got into a car accident and a ski accident that kind of made me stay away from work for a while. And then I totally shifted into this job over from that time that I was given. And so I kind of feel like there were little whispers, there were little things that were telling me over time, like while I was still teaching, get out, get out, get out, right? Little things in the back of my head, little situations that were getting harder and harder. And then eventually, this big rug pulled out from under me scenario where I got into a car accident and then a ski accident in 2 weeks, right? And then had to take 6 months off of work to reassess and reevaluate. So I guess it can be nuanced in the sense that it could we call this divine intervention possibly, or do we call this like the piece of source directly assigned to me who was actually throwing the little pebbles and whispers at me? Like, I guess the question would be, who was that?
Yeah. So you went in a few different directions there, and I'm kind of deciding or thinking like where the best entry point is.
Yeah, that's okay. Take
Okay. I'm gonna do my best. I'm gonna use language that's familiar to me, and I'll do my best to interpret for everyone.
Yeah.
So this is talked about in a lot of different places that there's your soul has different layers. There's different aspects of your soul. We have the nefesh, so which resides in our body in this physical world.
Okay.
Then there's ruach, which means wind, it means spirit, and then there's neshama. So those are nefesh, ruach, neshama are the parts of the soul that are probably most the language we've probably heard the most that we're most familiar with. Um, then above the neshama or connected to the neshama it would be chaya, which means alive, life, and then there's yechida, which means the one or what or yeah, like the point. So to to understand that we have higher aspects of ourselves, and that highest aspect yichida is that point which is so di- almost undifferentiated from source itself. And
Mm.
if we could cultivate our intuition and bridge ourselves up through nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya, yichida, then we could hear the messages of what our higher self is trying to tell us. And further from that, whereas our nefesh is residing in a physical world where we have a physical body and there's ego and there's chase and we're fighting our physical animalistic desires, our ruach and neshama only want are coming from like that higher place of no, we want you to fulfill the mission that you came into this world to do. So it will help you course correct. To your point earlier, there will be things that present itself into your life, which if you're listening and you're paying attention, you're attuned, will help you course correct. So the second part of the thing that I didn't want to necessarily get into immediately, unless it's a road you want to go down, is like, so where does free will work out? But that's like that's
Yeah.
like a whole nother conversation. But to focus on the point of the soul, there's this understanding that yes, we have a physical body, we live in a physical world, but there are higher aspects of the soul that we need to cultivate and have, an experience through as well. And you know, I can go into further detail on that if you're interested.
Yeah, no, this is really beautiful. And I think that like if I was to try to boil this down to like a more commonplace kind of terminology, like one might maybe refer to that as a higher self, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. So
absolutely.
and so I guess like and you can say that like this is always sort of the debate or sort of what we're always trying to pinpoint is like maybe the definition or pinpointing like where are the intuitive downloads coming from isn't as necessary as to what end they're coming for, right? Which is to help you become the highest version of yourself. And so if it's a different version of yourself or even the most aligned or connected version of yourself, that's the most connected version to source, and that's what's maybe coming through, then at the end of the day, does it matter what we label it, right? Like, is it your higher self? Is it your spirit guide? Is it source? Like, I could almost wonder, I feel like maybe we could say that they're all synonymous with the same thing, right? And then
Yes.
maybe to varying degrees as you laid it out.
And I think where you will get pushback from certain, elements is in two places. One is like we have in our tradition, you know, great rabbis, we have in our, prophets, and the question would be like, but who are you? You're just a girl from
Mm,
Ontario, right? But who
yeah.
are you? Who says you could do it, right? And then the second piece of that is like, okay, so but practically speaking, right here now, like, why do I need to think about all these things? Why do I need to worry about all these things? Like, I'm living in this worth. I've got kids. I got a job. I got, like, why do I have to bother myself with these things? And without, obviously, I have an opinion on those things, and I'm not trying to tell anybody that their opinion is wrong. Like you mentioned earlier, we've had a session. I listen to them. I try to listen to the message. I try to cultivate my intuition. I think that a lot of spirituality has become democratized, for lack of a better word, in
Mhm.
last number of years. Like, there's been, a big secular movement in yoga and in spiritual and in meditation and plant-based medicines that are allowing people to open themselves up in the world as a whole. And so to believe that within our tradition, only dead rabbis or even alive rabbis or have the capability of telling us things about our soul just seems a little bit short-sighted to me. um so yeah, I think it's definitely there. It's definitely, that the aspect of understanding the higher self and hearing the higher self. you know I have questioned and I don't have an answer to it, but like, as I articulated earlier, we spend a lot of time studying and engaging in, you know intellectual pursuits of Judaism. As you can see on my bookshelf behind me, especially in the Orthodox circles, studying Talmud is of primacy, and we study Jewish law, and we study, the five, we study Tanakh, the five books of Moses and prophets. There's so much studying and there's you go to synagogue, and every night of the week there's another class, and it's wonderful and it's great, but there's very little, from my experience at least, being taught and how to cultivate your intuition and how to kind of quiet the intellect, quiet the brain, and allow yourself to, like, hear and listen.
Mhm. Do you have a perspective on why that is?
Um,
Like, I wouldn't, I don't know if I would say it's even discouraged, but it doesn't seem to be like a mainstream part of the religion either.
yeah. So I think the one of the reasons is that we've always the Jews have had a very challenging history,
Mhm.
and you know, just to back up for a second, there's within all the books I mentioned earlier, there's what's called the written Torah and the oral Torah, Torah Shebaal Peh and the Torah Shebaksav. Initially, only parts of the Torah were written down. It was only around the destruction of the temple that they started writing down more and more of the Torah. And then was only with the invention of the printing press that the Torah was then really be able to get disseminated. Because historically, before that, if you wanted to learn, there was a few people, a few wealthy people, a few rabbis who had manuscripts, and everybody would kind of and sit around and listen. And so that's one piece of our history which I think has informed why we live the way we live today and how we live the way we live today. And I think another part of that is that before there was the world's distractions that we have, modern technologies that keep us, distracted in 100 directions. I think it was easier to cultivate your intuition because you went to sleep when the sun went down. You didn't have electricity keeping you up. You weren't watching TV till to all kinds of hours. In the last few hundred years, there's been this, we need to learn more. We need to focus our energy more. We need to shelter ourselves more from the outside world. We need to do all these things because we live with all this modern technology, which is, if we don't have that, will distract us. If I
Mm,
don't go to a class in my synagogue at night, then I'll, watch 2 3 hours of Netflix every single night, right? Which is
mm,
not, which is not a good thing either. So I think that's one part of it, is that there's always, we've been fighting against, you know the world trying to destroy us, so to speak. And and we need to preserve, what that tradition, and to preserve the tradition requires a strong basis of intellectual pursuit. And I think, kind of the more, I would say, skeptic or cynicism of why we don't talk about it, or why, is because I think a lot of the rabbis, so to speak, don't really know it themselves. I don't think there's a strong tradition of it exists. There have always been, and there will continue to be, especially in the last 250, 300 years, really, since the Baal Shem Tov and the Hasidic movement has really spawned and become what it is. There's always been people who are engaged more in, especially in the Sephardic community. Yeah, there's always been people who are very engaged in the spiritual life, but that's never been something that's been like taught and sit down and teach people how to quiet the mind and how to cultivate the intuition. Like, uh, and I don't know. I think because a lot of it has been handed over by the tradition through the rabbis, that how to keep the laws and how to practice the laws in order to maintain the tradition, because you know we're in exile, we're not in the land of Israel, we're living in a shtetl in Europe, we're living in, we're getting expelled from Spain or Portugal. Like, we're always on the run. So, like, what's more important, learning how to hear our messages, or just knowing how to keep Sabbath and keep the tradition? Because if I don't keep the tradition, I won't have the tradition to give to my kids. And if I don't give it to my kids, then it's all going to be lost. So I think because we've always been, you know, this is something I talk about with my children, like Maslow hierarchy of needs. You
Yeah.
know, we're historically, the Jewish people have always been like, you know, at that lower threshold. We're worried for our lives. How are we going to put a roof over our head? How are we going to get food? I think now that there's some stability in the world, despite wars and other things that have happened historically, but
Yeah.
there's a perception of stability. There's a level of affluence that we have. Like, my children, thankfully, are not going to be worried, about putting food on the table
Right.
and a roof over their heads. And, like, I could be wrong. My grandparents, were survivors of the Holocaust, but that's
Yeah.
I don't believe we're in a world that we would allow that to happen to that degree again.
Right.
We'd have to go down the road of what's going on since last year. But
I know.
I think because now we've built, we have establishments of Torah where we've built that educational system, and we have the printing press, and every Jew I know has a library like this in their house, and because I've gotten a strong, yeshiva education, which 150 years ago, that such a thing didn't exist. Kids got an education till 8, 9, 10 years old, and then they went off to work, and then they got married very young, and then had families because they were dying when they were 40, right? In order but now that we have longevity and we have the ability to indulge ourselves, and to, okay, I have a basis of Jewish tradition and knowledge, and I will be able to pass that on to my children, and they can observe how they choose to observe. Okay, now let me take this now let me go to the higher level thinking. How do I transcend? How do I, you know, enlightenment, or whatever, Maslow's hierarchies, would look like. So that's
Yeah.
kind of how I see this shift and this change, and why historically there hasn't been this, but there's a lot more out there. There's, whether it's through Chabad or podcast, like, there's a lot more exposure to the secrets and the hidden parts of the Torah that are now becoming more revealed as more people are opening up spiritually in the world.
Yeah. And that just gives you like such I think it's beautiful because it's such kind of like a view of hope for the Jewish people as well, of like maybe we've been just running for our lives so much, as you said, that there's not been time to kind of really dive into maybe the deeper meanings behind it, and maybe if we kind of do take the time to do that, we can start to see that maybe all of these practices are the whole point, right? The whole point is to kind of achieve that level of spirituality, a deeper meaning to our actual life, right? So I mean, it's one thing to just pass on the traditions and the things you do and don't do, but it's another thing to pass on a feeling of complete, deep-hearted or heartfelt meaningfulness in your life as well, which I sort of feel has been, the result of doing this kind of work, or connecting to your intuition rather. So yeah,
For
it's so
sure.
beautiful. So thank you. I do want to switch gears a little bit, and I do want to ask about angels, because this is sort of something that is in the Jewish tradition. I mean, we do call upon archangels for protection. We do have like a whole song like calling in Archangel Michael and Gavriel and Raphael. Like we do talk about angels a lot in Judaism. We have, we call them in on right at the beginning of Shabbat as well. So we talk about the Shabbat angels, right? So there's something to be said about angels, and I'm curious, sort of what the perspective is on that, and is there also, like, we know that we sort of do believe in the existence of archangels, so how does that sort of fall in the hierarchy of things that kind of fall underneath the category of separate from God or part of God? And then the other thing I want to ask, this is a two-parted question, is what is your perspective on the idea that there are other angels that aren't archangels but are just directly assigned to us, that are there to ensure our safety, right? That maybe are saving your life if you're accidentally about to end it, right? And somebody, reaches out and pulls you out from the burning car or whatever it is. Is there something to be said in Judaism about that concept?
Sure. So yeah, I don't want to. I don't want to restate the caveat. I'm not an expert. I'm just
Yeah.
telling you what I understand and my understanding of all this.
Yeah.
So I described earlier that we have different aspects of the soul. The
Mhm.
other piece of it that I didn't really get into is that there are actually four worlds. That Okay, there's God, who's all that is, and then He allows through the creation. There's an unfolding process. Those four worlds are Atzilus, Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya.
Okay.
So we live in the world of Asiya, action. We have a physical body, we do physical things, and that's where our neshama resides. But in those higher worlds, there are, besides our soul, which is coming down from God, from the source, coming through those worlds, there's energy that comes down, which flows through spheros, right? Which are, spheros would be like chakras, I guess, in secular terminology. And those are like basically the world couldn't, if God's energy was flowing direct into the world, that creative source and substance of all that is was flying directly to the world, like it would overwhelm us and we couldn't absorb it. So there needed to be a system where that energy got filtered into the creation. So there's different spiritual ways that this happens. In these worlds exists other spiritual entities, which are, as you said, there are malachim, there are seraphim, there are ophanim, there are chaye hakodesh. These are different words that I can't translate because I don't know that they have really good translations. But a seraph is a type of angel. Chayos hakodesh are celestial animals. Um, Again, they're allegorical. They're not, they're meant to create some sort of imagery, but they're really there to be those mediums and those from up on high, from God, the creator, to down into this world. And so you mentioned the archangels. You forgot one. Uriel is another one. Um, and so they have like a permanent fixture. And we, like you said, there are songs that we can call them in. They provide us with healing. They provide us with protection as messengers of God, the Creator. So when we do call them in, we're not praying to them. We're praying for their power. We're praying for the power that they've been given from the Creator. They've been given power too. So I was actually at a class the other night, and the rabbi said that if you're ever like downtown and there's like you're gonna get mugged, you're in a bad situation, if you scream out the name Uriel 7 times, like it'll scare the person off. Which sounds almost like Harry Potter, because I think one of his things was like an illuma something, which is light. Uriel means
Mhm.
the light of God.
Yeah.
So again, I don't know. Again, that's above my pay grade, so to speak.
Yeah.
But yes, so there's the archangels who have a permanent fixture, and then there's, I guess, lack of a better word, there'd be like temporary angels, who have given like one mission to accomplish one thing, and then when they accomplish that one thing, their mission has been completed. And we interact with those angels through our prayers. We When we pray, our words get brought up to the kisei, to the seat, to the creator, to different parts of those higher worlds. Our prayers get elevated because we are humans and we don't always have the proper intentions when we pray. Like we try to dial it in, we try to be focused, but realistically speaking, I'm giving 15 minutes to pray in the middle of the day when I've just gotten off a conference call and I'm going to another conference call, and I'm trying to be mindful. I'm trying to be present. I'm trying to say my prayers with as much intention as possible. But you know, it's tough. You don't always get there. You want the way you want to get there, and so there's this idea that when we pray, there are angels that help our prayers ascend. There's a piece of prayers that we say every single day that it's part of the when you repeat the benediction, you repeat the Shemona Esrei.
Mhm.
There's what's called the kedusha, and we say kadosh 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 Hashem tzvos malach haaretz kvodo ve'elfanim v'serafim v'chayos hakodesh marash. They respond, and we say kadosh 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 3 times, and then the malachim, the serafim, and they respond, and they say baruch shem kavod malchuso leolam va'ed. So we say something, and then the malachim up in heaven they're saying something, they're responding. We say this in our prayers, like it's like so which is it's interesting. It's not talked about, and it's like an open secret. Like yes, there are these angels, but since we don't really understand them, we don't really talk about them. But yet, when we pray, they're involved in the prayer situation. So the little bit of uncovering I've done is like, well, what does this mean, and what are they there for? And so again, I wouldn't say I'm an expert on it, but like yes, there are angels. They exist. We interact with them knowingly or unknowingly. Some are permanent, some are temporary. Yeah, it's a part of the creation.
Yeah, yeah. That's so beautiful. I definitely have seen that line in prayer many times, and I didn't realize that that was supposed to be angels responding. So, thank you for that piece of knowledge. I had no idea.
So
That's really
what's
cool.
what what's interesting, like there's a is that the angels could only say one or the other. They can't say both, but
Mm,
humans can say both. So it lends the rabbis to interpret that the human experience is actually higher than the angelic experience. That when God was giving the Torah to the Jewish people, the angels came to him and said, "Why don't you give it to us?" It's a conversation in a midrash, right? Why don't you give it to us? And God said, "You don't have a physical body that you need." The reason to have the Torah, the reason to have the mitzvos, is so that we could subdue the physical urges, and like we said earlier, we could uplift the physical into something spiritual. You're an angel, you're spiritual. You don't have the physical body with the physical urges, and that you need to master and control. You don't need the Torah. But
mm,
there's this idea for sure that the Jewish people have, so to speak, the Jewish people, the people who engage in this recognition, that we almost have one up on the angels. Like, while yes, the angels are completely spiritual in nature and they have like this spiritual mediumship, they can't influence the physical world that the way we can. The only time they're making an appearance here, so to speak, is through a directive of the creator, not of their own volition. That's my understanding.
okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I really love that perspective. I do then also want to ask a little bit about reincarnation, right? And this sort of idea that we have this infinite soul that can come back over and over and over again into a human body. I was actually doing some reading on this last night because there was, at least from what I understood, there was sort of a Kabbalistic understanding that they said that Cain, as in like Adam's son, then came back as Noah and then came back again, was it as Abraham? I'm not sure, but like it came back again, right? And so it, and these are sort of like different characters that we play, and but the soul itself is infinite. And so I'm curious on sort of what the Jewish perspective is or the Kabbalistic perspective is on us having past lives, and to what end? Like, what's the point if we do?
Yeah. So souls have contracts. I guess they come into this world. I guess that's the word I would use. They come into this world with a certain mission, objective, something they need to bring forward, or something that they need to they need to bring it forward into this world, or alternatively they need to fix while in this world, because once they don't have a physical body, they can't really change it's more static in the upper realms. Their status of their of where they reside in those worlds doesn't really change very much. So they need to come into a physical body to make those changes happen. So, as you mentioned, we've documented certain souls. You're probably right. I forget exactly whose souls reincarnated into whom. But yeah, we have this idea in our tradition that there are new souls, there are young souls that maybe have not had as many go arounds, but there are certainly souls that have come through this world and embodied in physical form in various times of history and various shapes and form. Like, there is, I've seen, I guess it's an argument in the commentators whether if you become a Jewish soul, do you remain a Jewish soul? Could you go from a Jewish soul to a not Jewish soul? Like, I think the jury's still out on that. I mean, I've never seen like a definitive ruling. Like, once you're a Jewish soul, you're always a Jewish soul. Like, but there certainly is that discussion of what that means to be a Jewish soul or not be a Jewish soul, because there is this idea that all the Jewish souls stood at the mountain at Mount Sinai to and received the Ten Commandments. So what does that mean? Does that mean you can't convert? No, we have converts all the time. Does that mean that if you were born Jewish, your soul, will come back as a Jew over and over and over again? Or does that mean that you could, again, I don't have all the answers. These are just like pontificating on the questions that are then, then come from this line of thinking, this line of questioning. But certainly the idea that, our soul chooses what it needs to accomplish in this world and then comes into this world, forgets its contract, forget what it forgets. That's the idea that when we're in our mother's stomach, it says that we're see it's interesting. It says that we see from one end to the other end. We learn the entirety of the Torah. And again, you can't interpret that it means we learn all the books on my bookshelf. It means that we learn the purpose. We learn what we're here to do. We're learning, why God created the world and what the soul is supposed to. We learn all those things. But then the angel touches us just above our lips, and that's why we have that little, and we forget everything. And I've read in interesting books at some point that there was a baby born and didn't and it came out like newborn baby just like saying stuff like, and like they brought it to a big saint, a big Jewish saint, and he like it's like, this soul has been here so many times before, and it didn't get the angel didn't forget when the angel touched him. So the rabbi touched him and then he forgot and he stopped talking and he stopped saying all this. Like, I've read this in books. Like, I wouldn't say this on a podcast. I wouldn't repeat this if it wasn't something that I had seen somewhere along the way, because I'm not making it up. But like, there are some interesting kind of outlandish, far-fetched things that, like, if I didn't read it, I wouldn't believe it. But yes, it's happened.
Yeah, it's definitely a Jewish concept, which I love, because definitely in the work that I do, when I connect with somebody and I call in their spirit guides, I can easily access their previous lives, and we can like look back and see like what circumstances their soul has been in prior to this lifetime, and usually it will translate to maybe some of the um I guess that it can look, I don't want to say lessons, because that's the wrong word. It can look like maybe some of the fears, unexplained fears that they may have, or sort of talents or gifts that they have, if we can kind of refer back to previous lifetimes they've had, or even like memories of places, right? If you've ever been to a place that in this lifetime you've never been to before, but it feels so familiar for some reason, and you feel like you could walk the streets without a map, right? There's something to be said that maybe we don't totally forget everything, right? That our soul maybe remembers more than we do. And sometimes there's like a part of us that maybe does. So I don't know how you feel about that, but I definitely like that. That's one of the things that when we do connect to our intuition, we can start to remember again. And I guess what I do want to know is, at least for me, and I feel like for our listeners, the most important part is that yes, it's great to know that our soul can come back, that we're these infinite souls, but almost I always wonder, sort of like, well, then to what end, right? What's the purpose? And I always like to say that you keep coming back over and over again, until you sort of achieve more of an understanding of, if you call it enlightenment, if you will, this really deep belief that you are a piece of source, that you are a piece of the master, that you're connected to it. And with each lifetime that you come back, you get closer and closer to fully embodying that understanding. So I'm curious your perspective on that.
Yeah, so it's definitely brought down in different sources that the we're not living this world for the purpose of this world. We're living this world for what's called the Olam Haba, the world to come. And again, there's different interpretations. Exactly, there's the Olam Haneshamos, there's the world of souls. There's these different terms that are put out there that, again, I have limited definition for how to really, because my experience of them was before I was Chaim in this world, so I don't want to go into like too many specifics as to exactly what they mean. But certainly the idea is that the soul, when it goes out of this physical realm and into we'll use the word Olam Haba, the world to come, it wants to, it's the the joy and the benefit and the pleasure that it receives is from its proximity to source, to the creator.
Mm.
And I think I mentioned earlier that the soul could have, there's low, once you're on a level in the next world, so your family members, once you're deceased, your family members and people will do merits on your behalf, and they'll try to elevate your soul. They'll, we'll recite psalms, we'll do different things to elevate the soul of the deceased. But it's only going to make, like, I from my, again, from my understanding, there'll be marginal difference. It'll grow a little bit, but the soul will then choose to come back to accomplish more, so that it could further elevate its level, its status, to come closer and closer to source. It's you know there's this idea that there's, you know the greats, Moshe and the people who, there's like this heavenly court where they're all sitting and they're just, radiating from. It's hard to understand what this means, because we live, everything we visualize has is based on what we experience in our world, and from,
From a
influence
physical
we see
place.
from Hollywood and movies. But
Right.
there's this idea that, they're sitting with, like, the crowns on their head. They're, having achieved the highest possible status, so to speak. Obviously, it's not a status like, you know top 100 status, like Billboard chart, or, People magazine type of status. They but yeah, the soul wants to elevate its status, and it wants to accomplish more in the physical realm, so that its spiritual existence, which is an infinite existence, like, our physical existence is whatever, 80, 90 plus years, God willing, in health. And but it's not, it's finite. And if your soul is going to have an infinite experience, you want it to be a good one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even what you're talking about when we talk about motion and stuff, there's a term in sort of more conventional spirituality. I don't know, mainstream spirituality, where we talk about sort of ascended masters, if you will, or like someone who's achieved mastery, maybe, which is maybe someone who has done just that. Like we would definitely consider Moshe a master of some kind, right? Someone who's achieved enlightenment, if you will.
Yeah.
And so it feels like then maybe we come back over and over again until we sort of really do, merge the two really well, where we kind of do bring the light to the physical world so much so that we've elevated our soul in some way. So
Yeah, I would add, though, that sometimes the soul is going to coming down here because it needs to learn the lesson that it's a soul has having a physical experience, and it needs to learn that. And I think some souls come down with the objective of teaching it to others, like they already know, and it's they accept upon themselves, like, okay, I'll do another round in this world, I'll go through it over again, because I know that at this point in time in history, humanity needs me, and I'm willing to endure. Like, physical existence is an endurance for the soul. It's there's places where it talks about the pain of the separation of the body from the soul upon death. Like, there's a physical, the physical world is not an easy world. It's it there there's a lot that goes into living a physical existence, which is, the pain body experience. So the soul will come in down and say, okay, I'll do another round in this world, because I know that the universe needs me, the world needs me to be teaching others this truth, and helping, inspire that. And I think there may be souls that kind of halfway along, they get it, they get that point, and they flip, and they go from student to teacher. So
Mhm.
yeah,
That's really
there's
beautiful because, we do I too talk about this, and I kind of refer to these souls as kind of like earth angels. They're not I mean, that's maybe not the proper Jewish term, but sort of this idea of like it's a soul that maybe has already ascended, that has already kind of achieved mastery in some way, and doesn't have to come back down to learn lessons, but is choosing to come back down to shed light here on the planet and to share that light. And so it's interesting that there's a Jewish concept related to sort of that mainstream word, which we would now call an earth angel, maybe. Right? So that's so interesting.
Yeah, so again, it's hard to use terminology, like,
Ye
interchangeably, like, especially
yeah,
if you, like, go from, like, Kabbalistic or spiritual ideas to, like, new age things. But
yeah.
the messaging is certainly there, that it's one and the same, that there's this idea of elevated souls that embody physical form for, higher purpose than, that, you know, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do have one more question for you, and then I know we might be short for time and have to wrap up soon. But I am curious about this idea because you did mention, and I maybe I misinterpreted just from the Hebrew because you did say "olam neshamas," and I wondered if that was sort of where our souls sit after we've passed away, and or is that a different concept? But I do want to ask about sort of loved ones who have passed away. So once you have passed away, this idea of like being able to connect with those loved ones once when we're still here on the earth plane, when we're still here physically incarnated. What's the Jewish perspective on allowance to doing so? Do we feel like we can connect with them? And is it? I guess is it allowed? And then if so, I guess I'm just curious about whether or not this is like something that we should or can develop, and what the Jewish perspective is on that. Mm.
Yeah. So the way I understand it is that Olam Haneshamos, they're before the soul, after the soul leaves physical body, um, there's a period of basically a year, it's 11 months, where the soul has not yet fully ascended.
Right.
And there may be a period of it's we don't it's not really hell. We don't really have like there's no but
No,
there
like
is
a
a
reflection
there's
period.
a it's a purgatory period where the soul kind of is lingering before it goes to its ultimate place of resting, where that's a lower like of the worlds that I described earlier. That Olam Anishamos would seem to me to be kind of a little bit of a like a no man's land. It doesn't have a physical. It doesn't have its defined resting place. But Olam Haba would be one of those higher worlds or those higher places closer to the place of the divine, closer to the place where they're going to rest infinitely, closer to their source, the creator. uh I'm struggling with like because I don't have a clear experience of it. It's hard for me to give a clear definition of it. I'm just
Mhm.
giving it from like the words that I've read and kind of what I've imagined it all to look like.
Yeah.
uh, so interesting. I'll tell you the story because at my Shabbat dinner table last week, I heard this story now secondhand from the person who it happened to. So this woman is at my table, and she was talking to somebody she knows, and the somebody she knows had a dream, and the dream was that a man came to her and said, "Tell my five princesses that I'm okay." And the woman's like didn't know what it meant, and you know very rarely even remembers her dreams.
Right.
And I think I'm getting all the points of the story correct, but either way, this woman was at in a certain community, not her home community, spending Shabbat there, and she's a little bit of like a Jewish influencer, so to speak, a Jewish celebrity. And so the at the end of Shabbat, a woman said to her, said, there was a woman in our community who is sitting Shiva. She recently lost her father, and she couldn't come to this week's activity. She could because she's in mourning, she's in Avelis, and you're not supposed to be doing communal things. But I'm sure it would mean a lot to her if you went to her house and made a visit. It's called a Shiva call. Go into her house, and make a visit. And this woman who had this dream went to this lady's house, didn't really know her, to make the Shiva call. Sitting Shiva, sitting on the floor or on the low chairs, were a mother and four daughters, five princesses. And on the picture was the man who came to her in the dream.
Oh, wow.
Okay, and said, so she was the medium to tell this message. So she said to the ladies, like, you don't really know me, like, you know me because I'm a Jewish celebrity, like, you know me, but you don't really know me. But I just want you to know your dad's okay. Like, he says he's fine. Whatever the circumstances around his death, I guess there was, it wasn't the easiest passing, or the family was concerned. Maybe either way, gave this message. So that fast forward, this Jewish influence woman is talking to another Jewish woman and says, let me tell you the story. I had this dream, five princesses, man came to me, said, tell them I'm okay. The woman she's telling, she says, you're joking. I had the exact same dream.
No.
Yeah, it's better. One of the daughters reaches out to this woman and says, I want you to know, I said, like, Dad, if I, I want you to send a message. I want you to tell two reliable people that you're okay and pass the message back to me.
Oh
So
god. I have full body chills right now.
so this she told the story at my Friday night table just this past week, and I was like, oh, that's crazy because I'm talking to Jessica this week, and this is what she does. So
Yeah.
yes, we could talk to souls. Yes, souls could communicate back to us. Is there a tradition of when to do it and how to do it and why to do it? I've never seen it. I've never seen it documented. It's not talked about. Again, just to like dial back, everything that's talked about is like how to build connection with God. That is like if there was like one theme that runs through like the practice of Judaism as I experienced it in my life, it's like how to have connection with God. Tefillah, mitzvos, service, all of those things. But in our tradition, when you start peeling back all the layers, there are angels, there are souls, there's an afterlife, there's all of these things that get talked about, get mentioned, but we don't really get like we don't do a deep dive into them because you know we think that our time and our efforts are better spent doing other things. Yes, or arguably. Now, I'm not that my I don't I'm not expressing my opinion on that, but yes, there's it's interesting what's when you start looking for your messages and you start asking the questions, it's interesting what turns up.
Yeah. Oh, it's so beautiful and I love it so much because it just gives you so much hope that like there all of those things like we know on a subconscious level like it's all there, right? And our souls ourselves possibly know, right? On a soul level we know these things and so then it's like if you go looking for it then you become more aware of it. And it just gives so much more meaning to your day-to-day life of like the just like do the regular hit the milestones, do the things that you're told to do, but rather there's a whole other world beyond what we actually see and it does bring so much more meaning to our lives. So definitely gives a lot more purpose and I do love that. And I know for me, I don't actually like to do mediumship very often. I can, and that was definitely my first experience with connecting to my intuition was that as I was trying to figure out what do I do with my life, what's my path and my purpose, it was my grandfather who had passed away who came through, and I saw him in a vision. Really, I was awake, I was meditating, and he had just passed away. And my aunt, we had just found out that she had cancer, breast cancer, and he came through so clearly, and he told me that she's going to be okay, and you need to know this, and you need to tell her, you need to tell my father, like her brother, and then he started telling me all of these things about his childhood and his life and his parents that I had never been told. And I think he was trying to confirm for me that it was him I was speaking to. And so then I went and I called my dad right away and I said, all of these things about, I'm like, are these things true? Like, did he grow up like this? And what about this purple tie that he's talking about? And all of these things. My dad just started bawling over the phone, which by the way, my father never cries in front of me. And he goes, yeah, that's all true. You did. You spoke to him, right? So, and that was kind of my first step into like, oh my God, like you can if you connect, you get quiet enough, they're there. You can connect to them. So, yeah, so beautiful. Yeah, amazing. Well, this has been so beautiful, Chaim, and I'm so grateful to you for coming on and sharing all of your beautiful perspectives. But I do want to ask you one last question, which is for anybody who's listening to this, Jewish or not, who is sort of going through a spiritual awakening or wanting to do a little bit more of a deeper dive into their spirituality and just sort of create more meaning in their life, what would you suggest, right? What do you suggest they do? How do you suggest they approach that? Yeah, in their everyday life. Mm.
Oh wow, advice to others. Still trying to give advice to myself. I mean, I could only tell you really from my own experience, like really what's worked for me. So as I kind of alluded to, I had somewhat of a you know breakdown crisis type of experience in my life, and it required me to really build up, build back up. And for me, there was a lot of podcasts and books just to kind of expose myself to ideas that were less familiar to me. And kind of to my point earlier, because I was raised with idea of education and building up my intellect, it took me some time to really get comfortable with this. But I've since 2016 I have a daily meditation practice, mindfulness, just sitting and learning to be present in the moment. And that's probably been one of my greatest superpowers that I've cultivated both because of its, physiological benefits, being calm, being present, being, just, but also like just learning how to align yourself with the creative flow of energy which is happening in the universe at all times. Like that's that's kind of been, the path that I've taken. So there are other things that I do, there are other practices that I have, but I think for people who are curious, like there's so much information out there. I think if you're starting to scratch that itch, it means that the universe is telling you to like start moving in that direction. I don't think, there is this idea that I've heard from other people, like that you have to have a complete breakdown before you have a build up again. I don't believe that that's true. I think you could have a smoother transition without having a complete breakdown, without, God forbid, having, a rash breakout on your body or something even worse. Like I think you could transition from, the being unaware to becoming aware. And I think, but once you become aware, there's, it's not like it's like a dimmer switch. You can keep getting brighter and brighter and brighter. And that's kind of where I am on this process. Like whenever I have conversations with you or people like you, it's like sometimes I wish, like, yeah, I wish I could just like get real quiet and hear and talk to angels. And then sometimes I'm like, no, it's probably good that I can't. I'm not the jury's still out on that for me. But yeah, we're in this life. It's not a sprint. It's certainly a marathon, and we need to just keep, one step forward every single day, continuing to make progress. And a part of that is, our physical health, our emotional health, and our spiritual health. And to reveal more light in this world by becoming more enlightened and aware ourselves, and then sharing that truth and that realization with others.
Wow. That is so beautiful. I feel like that's just like mic drop right there. You can just that's exactly it. So thank you so, so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on here and share all of your beautiful insights. It's definitely information that I did not have enough of enough knowledge on. And so I'm really happy that you were able to share some of the things that you have learned over time. And I really hope that we'll get to have you back. So thank you so much for being here.
It was my pleasure, and I'm always happy to do a follow up, around two. I mean, I'm not a public figure, but if there are people from your community that have specific questions or want to speak to somebody kind of with my background, if I'm not the person, I'm happy to try to connect them to that person. But you're welcome to, introduce me to people if you think there's, something I could add benefit or add value to them. I'm happy to be a resource for your community in any way possible.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And we'll definitely put all of the information for people to reach out to you in the show notes. So thank you so much for that. Amazing. Thank you so
Have a
much,
great day.
Chaim.
Take care.